Good morning, welcome back to Black Bear Forge. What do you say we get back to work on our herb chopper? And that's herb as in the green leafy things that you put with your food, and not Herb, the neighbor down the street. The first thing I want to do is get the profile of this correct, and I'm going to do all of this with hand files, then we're going to do some hand sanding. It is a much more labor-intensive process if you do it that way, but it's something that is within reach of just about everybody. You need a couple of files, maybe an assortment of sandpaper depending on how fine a finish you want, and some sort of sharpening stones. A belt grinder is certainly the fastest way to do this, and if you're doing it in production and you want to make 100 of these to take to craft shows, you're probably going to want a belt grinder. But if you're just making one or two for yourself or for Christmas gifts, there's no reason you can't do it with files. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a line. I think I'll probably trim this down to bring this point down a little bit more. But I want to create a curve here. I don't know if I can do this as cleanly. It'd be nice if this corner pulled out a little bit further, but that's about 1.5 inches. I think that's going to be a good curve there, so I need to take all this off. I need to clean this up. It's got a little bit too crisp of an edge right here. I think I would rather have that a little bit rounder so it's more comfortable to hold on to. We can probably do almost all of the profiling and a lot of the work on the blade itself with just one good, coarse, half-round file. The final step I'm going to take before we get ready to harden and temper is I'm going to draw file this. And this is moving the file lengthwise and pushing the file sideways. And this produces a finer scratch pattern than filing the normal way does. So it's a good first step to getting ready for finishing. That's everything we need to do to this before hardening and tempering. It's ready to go ahead and go to that step. We forged this in the coal fire, so we'll go ahead and harden and temper it in the coal fire. Like I usually do, I'm going to refer to the app on my cell phone, the Heat Treater's Guide Companion, to get the specifics of what I need to do for proper hardening here. They aren't very good about tempering information, but I think we can work with that well enough. And in this app, I get to search for the alloy, and this is 1095. It's new steel that I bought for some other project years ago and just happen to have some left over. And this then says, for hardening, heat to 1475 Fahrenheit and quench in water, brine, polymer, or oil. So this has quite a variety of things that you can do with it. I assume that quenching it in brine or water is going to be harsher, result in a harder blade. And if you're making straight razors or surgical tools, that might be important. But for an herb chopper, I'm not sure I need it that hard. So I think I'm going to quench it in oil just to be a little bit safer, reduces the risk of warping some, reduces the risk of cracking. But 1475 is relatively cold in the grand scheme of things. That's just up to the point that it's starting to get into the incandescent colors. It is not a bright orange, and it's certainly not a bright yellow. So it's going to be a red color. We're just going to judge that by eye. This is another one of those steels that using a magnet to test magnetism is probably not a bad way to go. That temperature is going to be just a little above where it loses its magnetism. Fancier alloy steels like H13, S7 lose magnetism long before they get to their critical temperature. So that is not a good test for some of the fancier steels. Anyways, I'm going to go light a coal forge and we'll get to work hardening and tempering. By the way, all of that filing was about, half hour, 45 minutes of actual work. So not a terrible amount of work if you're just making a few of these. It's actually very close to what I want. I just want to kind of even off that corner a little bit. And I duck way down so the smoke goes over my head. That's one good argument for water hardening steels, is you don't get the smoke from the oil. I also frequently do this right next to the door of the shop. And I'm sure you guys can't see a thing down into this can. But I've been just quenching this last inch or so. When the oil quits bubbling there, then I'll quench the whole thing probably. Once it's below a red heat, you can go ahead and quench more of it. Okay, so that should be hardened. I'm going to go straight over to my toaster oven, set it 450, and I'm going to put this in there for an hour at 450. You can use your household kitchen oven if you want to. And there are other ways to do this, but I find that to be the most efficient for me, and it guarantees that I get a good even temper and I don't have to mess around with trying to guess by doing it at the forge. But once it's out of there, maybe we'll do a second tempering cycle just to show some of the other methods you could use to temper if you don't have an oven available. Now, I wanted to get this tempered as quickly as I could. If you leave it hardened without tempering it, all those stresses that you've built up in the material during the hardening process are trying to make this crack. And if you don't temper it soon enough, it may find a way to crack. Sometimes you get lucky and it doesn't, but I used to do this sometimes here in the shop when we weren't living here on the property and I didn't have a toaster oven, so I'd take them back home with me at the end of the day, and more than once I heard something sitting in the seat next to me in the car go think, and that was the crack happening that wouldn't have happened if I had tempered it a little bit sooner. So I like to get these in the toaster oven, get them tempered. It makes for a completely even temper all the way through. There's no hardened soft spots as a result of the tempering process. But you can do this with a torch or a hot block of steel, and we'll take a look at that here in just a minute and show you what that looks like. But when you're doing it that way, you have to clean this up and you have to get a shiny surface so you can see the temper colors run. And that means you got to take a little bit more time and you can't get it tempered as fast. Another good reason for just going straight to the oven. Now I'm going to put this in this drill press vise here. And I have some 220 sandpaper. This is actually a sanding belt that broke but wasn't worn out, so I'm just going to use that. You can get rolls of sanding strips an 1.5, 2 inch, 3 inch wide, depending on what you're trying to do. And you can get adhesive backed sanding strips, so you can just put them on some sort of a backing. And the adhesive strips are probably the best way to go, but they're probably more expensive. And hand sanding, you can go through a lot of this stuff because it tends to quit working a little bit faster, or at least you feel like you're working too hard when you're hand sanding compared to using a machine that kind of puts up with the fact that the sandpaper is getting dull. And this is 220 paper at this point. You can use coarser if you need to, but you're going to have to then work to get all those coarse scratch marks out. And this probably will not remove all the file marks. For my purposes, I'm not sure I care if I remove all the file marks. If you want to do that, you may have to go down to a 120 or even a 60 grit to get all the file marks out. Now I'm just going to start with this big piece of steel here that'll be a holdfast one day, but it serves for a tempering block at this point. Then we just want to put this with the cutting edge off and let the heat run from the spine of the blade down towards the cutting edge. And I'm looking for something in the darker bronze range, perhaps starting to turn purple, but not into the blue range. I think it's worth flipping this over from time to time. And this may take a while. This is not an instant thing, but the longer it takes, the more even it's going to be and the better job you're going to do of it. A lot of people will go ahead and do this 2 or 3 times to try and get it good and even. It's starting to show some color there, so I'm actually going to put that off the end of the block. I hope you can see that. Starting to turn purple up in here. So this is straw down along the cutting edge, rapidly going to bronze. And before this purple gets there, I'm going to go ahead and quench that. And that'll stop it at that point. I don't want to get it too far. We could try to bring the colors back, but it's a little inaccurate unless you polish it up again. But I think that's going to be okay right there. Certainly that's enough to illustrate that technique. You can do the same thing with a torch. Be really careful not to overheat it. It's really easy to get it too hot in one spot and draw way more temper than you want to. The first thing I'm going to do is go back to the 220 and take the tempering colors off of there and get that shine back up again. Then I'm going to decide how bad those leftover file scratches bother me. If they bother me a lot, I'm going to have to go to a coarser paper and get those out of there. If I decide I'm okay with them, and for my own personal use, I'm kind of okay with it. It's not really going to bother me. Just have to pay more attention to cleaning it and making sure it's dry, maybe a little light oil so they don't collect rust and food stuff. But if you're selling them or giving them as gifts, you might want to make sure you take all those out. And again, that's a lot easier on a belt sander, but it can be done with hand sanding. This just looks exactly like it did before, only it will happen a lot faster. I think I'm going to go to some 150 and see how that gets rid of some of those scratches. Like I say, on a belt sander, I'd go to 60 because I know it's not that much work to go 60, 120, 220, 400, whatever I've got to do. But in hand sanding, I really don't want to get too coarse a scratch mark in there if I can avoid it. Now I know a bunch of you in the comments on the previous video said you weren't going to be bored if you had to watch all of this, but this is going to be a couple hours work, I'm afraid, and I'm not going to video all of it. In fact, I probably won't even finish it today. I'll probably finish it up tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and meet you right back here in just a few seconds when I'm back to the final steps. Now I went ahead and took this back down to an 80 grit paper. Got rid of almost all the file scratches. There's just a few down a little bit closer to the edge of the blade, but not right at the edge. So they aren't going to affect it at all. Just a little bit of cosmetic stuff there. And now I'm into a 400 grit paper. So I went 80, 150, 220, and now I'm at 400. In these last few steps, I've tipped the paper a little bit towards the edge to help start sharpening this. It's still going to need a lot of work on stones. It isn't at all sharp yet. It's just starting to form a little bit of a bevel there. And I'm going to finish this up with some Scotch-Brite. I think you get away with a little bit coarser finish when you're hand sanding than you do if you're using the belt grinder, because the scratch pattern is a little bit random and it doesn't look like just a bunch of grinder marks. You get more of a matte finish or something like that, and it can look quite good. And of course, you need to take both sides down to the same degree of finish. Then it will be time to sharpen it. Now, when it comes to sharpening by hand, there is loads of personal preference involved. Just about everybody has their favorite methods, their favorite stones or favorite abrasives, and do whatever it is that makes you comfortable. Use the tools that you have available. A stick with abrasive paper glued to it is perfectly fine for sharpening. In the long run, it's not very cost effective because you have to replace the paper a lot, but if you're just sharpening a few things, this works out great. And if you need really coarse sharpening, you want to go to 60 grits to establish the bevel or something like that, that's not a bad way to go. When it comes to more refined sharpening, my preference is diamond stones. I really like the fact that they stay flat. You don't have to maintain them. They're easy to keep clean. But this needs a fair amount of work, and I do need to start coarse. So I have a carborundum stone, man-made oil stone, and this is what I'm going to start on the coarse side. Then I'll go to the fine side, and then I'll go to the fine and the extra fine diamond stone. And that should be enough for this. You can certainly go as fine as you want. You can use Japanese water stones up to 1200 grit. I think you can even get water stones in a finer grit than that. Just depends on what you want to do. That's all I need to do to this. It's a finished kitchen tool at this point. I'll probably put a little bit of food-safe oil on it, some sort of vegetable oil that I would actually cook with, and that's a good finish for this. The quenching oil all kind of cooks off during the temper, so there's none of that left on here at this point. Next step, let's test it out.